Night settles over a silent plantation where the wind still seems to carry whispers of the past. The sugar fields are empty now, but their soil remembers the footsteps of families torn apart. Somewhere inside a crumbling mansion, a forgotten diary lay hidden for over a century, ink stained with secrets that history tried to bury. Its pages do not describe distant events. They speak like a witness. They record auctions where mothers clutched their children, husbands disappeared into chains, and names were erased like they never existed. This was not just trade. It was the systematic destruction of families. As we open this lost diary, we are not just reading history. We are listening to voices that were never meant to be heard. Every line pulls back a curtain on what truly happened after families were sold, where they went, how they survived, and how some were lost forever. This is a story of separation, survival, and a truth so chilling that it was hidden for generations. If stories like this matter to you, make sure to subscribe and hit the bell so you never miss a hidden history like this. Drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. These voices deserve to be heard across the world. Torchlight bled across the yard like restless fireflies as the auction night began, turning every shadow into something predatory. Wooden platforms creaked under the weight of human lives being priced like livestock, while the air carried a metallic mix of sweat, fear, and molasses. Drums from distant quarters tried to mask the trembling silence of families who knew this night would fracture their world. Men in polished boots paced like predators, checking teeth, arms, and backs, as though they were inspecting broken tools. Mothers clutched children so tightly that their small ribs pressed against desperate palms, yet even that grip could not protect them. Above them, the plantation house loomed like a watching skull, its dark windows reflecting a cruelty that had been refined over generations. Somewhere in that mansion, the diary would later record this night, but the screams would never fully translate onto paper. Chains rattled before the first voice ever called a price, and that sound became a language of its own. It spoke of journeys without return, of roads lined with cotton instead of home. Enslaved fathers stood helpless as their sons were paraded forward, forced to straighten their backs while buyers debated their strength like gamblers. Women were separated in slow, methodical steps, as if distance could erase blood ties. Children cried into their mothers' shoulders, unaware that this was not temporary chaos, but a calculated ritual. The auctioneer's cadence cut through the night like a blade, rhythmic and merciless, turning breaths into bids. Every hammer strike echoed beyond the field, rippling through the cabins where others waited in terrified anticipation. Families were not broken accidentally that night. They were dismantled with intention. Buyers preferred isolation because loneliness made people easier to control, and the diary would later hint at this strategy in clinical handwriting. Brothers were sold to different plantations so they could not conspire, husbands sent upriver while wives remained behind to bear the weight of separation. Some parents were forced to watch their children walk away in chains, unable even to call their names aloud. The platform became a stage of living loss, where grief was visible but powerless. Lanterns flickered across faces, streaked with ash and tears, creating portraits of suffering that no history book could soften. Even the wind seemed to hesitate, carrying sobs across the sugar fields like drifting smoke. When a family was split, the trauma did not end with the final sale. It lingered in every movement as people were herded toward waiting wagons. Mothers tried to memorize the last glimpse of their children's backs, imprinting them onto memory like a scar. Fathers stared into darkness, knowing that the next sunrise would bring labor without the comfort of familiar voices. Overseers barked orders to drown out lamentations, afraid that collective grief might transform into resistance. Boots kicked up dust that coated skin and grief alike, blending pain with the land that would profit from it. The diary's pages would later describe this procession as routine, but nothing about it was ordinary to those living it. Each step toward the wagons felt like a march toward erasure. Inside the wagons, silence replaced crying because tears had become too dangerous. Chains bound wrists and ankles, yet the real prison was the uncertainty of never seeing loved ones again. Some people whispered prayers under their breath, others stared blankly at the wooden planks above them. The rhythm of wheels over dirt roads matched the pounding of broken hearts. Behind them, the plantation faded into darkness, but the memory of that night clung to their bodies like invisible iron. In those cramped spaces, family ties were stretched across distance, not severed, though few knew how to carry such weight. The diary would later note departures in neat columns, ignoring the human wreckage inside each transport. Back at the plantation, those who were not sold returned to cabins that suddenly felt hollow. Empty sleeping mats, abandoned cooking pots, and half-finished prayers filled the space with absence. Children who remained clung to surviving relatives, terrified that dawn might bring another auction. Elders tried to offer comfort through stories of endurance, yet even their voices shook. The fields outside waited patiently for labor, indifferent to the pain rippling through the quarters. In the quiet hours before morning, people searched the night sky for signs that their loved ones might still be under the same stars. The diary would later frame this as recovery, but there was no recovery, only survival. By dawn, the auction night dissolved into another day of forced work, yet its wounds stayed open. Sunlight revealed tear-stained faces and trembling hands gripping tools too heavy for their grief. Songs that once carried hope now carried mourning, their melodies stretched thin across the fields. Overseers pretended normalcy as though families had not been shattered hours earlier. Somewhere in the plantation house, the lost diary absorbed these events into its pages, treating human heartbreak like routine administration. Rivers glistened like dark veins under the moon as the first boats were loaded with human cargo bound for distant plantations. Flat-bottomed barges creaked under chains, iron and trembling bodies packed so tightly that breathing became a collective effort. Men with lanterns moved across the decks, counting people the way one might count sacks of grain before a shipment. The Mississippi stretched endlessly ahead, carrying whispers of separation far beyond the horizon. Families torn apart the night before now drifted deeper into unfamiliar territory, water slapping the hull like a slow heartbeat. Along the banks, cypress trees stood like silent witnesses, their reflections broken by the wake of forced migration. No one on those boats knew whether they were traveling toward survival or disappearance. Below deck, the air was thick with fear and rot, trapping the scent of sweat, salt, and sorrow. Shackled wrists rubbed raw against iron as the river carried them farther from everything they had ever known. Some people stared into darkness, trying to imagine where their loved ones might be, even as the current erased all traces of home. Others prayed quietly, hoping that the same stars would follow them wherever they were taken. Waves rocked the vessel in a cruel rhythm that mimicked lullabies twisted into torment. Above them, overseers paced with rifles, treating movement as suspicion and silence as submission. Every mile downstream felt like another thread of family history being cut. At distant docks, buyers waited like vultures circling prey, scanning bodies for strength rather than humanity. Traders lined people up in crooked rows, forcing them to step onto unfamiliar soil that felt colder than any chain. From here, some were sent deeper into cotton country, where fields stretched farther than the eye could see. Others were marched toward sugar plantations, where the heat would burn both skin and spirit. The diary would later list destinations in neat handwriting, reducing lives to locations on a map. Yet behind every destination was a journey filled with terror, exhaustion, and loneliness. The routes did not just move people, they scattered families like ash in the wind. Overland journeys were even harsher, as chained groups trudged along dirt roads under brutal sun. Wagons rattled beside them, carrying the sick, the elderly, and sometimes the children too small to walk. Dust-coated faces until tears carved pale tracks through grime. Nights were spent in makeshift camps where sleep rarely came, only fear. Guards built fires that flickered across chained silhouettes like ghostly shadows. Some people tried to whisper messages to passers-by, hoping word might reach a lost relative somewhere ahead or behind. Every step along these roads stretched the distance between family members into something unbearable. Rail lines that cut through plantations became new arteries of forced transport, iron rails humming with cruelty. Boxcars stuffed with enslaved people lurched forward with no regard for comfort or safety. Heat baked the metal walls during the day, while cold pierced through at night. Cries for water were often ignored, turning thirst into another weapon of control. Each stop along the tracks felt like a gamble between further separation or harsher fate. The sound of the engine replaced the rhythm of songs once sung together as families. Movement became endless, identity became fragile, and hope became dangerously thin. Meanwhile, those left behind tried to imagine where the soul had gone, tracing invisible routes in their minds. Some believed their loved ones were somewhere upriver. Others feared they had vanished into the deep south. Cabin walls absorbed their questions, while the fields offered no answers. People spoke in coded songs about rivers, roads, and distant lands, trying to keep connections alive through memory. Elders told stories of travelers who carried messages between plantations, though such chances were rare. The landscape itself felt fractured, as if the land remembered every family torn across it. Even the wind seemed to carry echoes of those moving farther away. The routes carved by forced migration did more than relocate bodies. They reshaped entire communities. New plantations absorbed strangers who shared grief but not kinship. Languages, traditions, and memories blended painfully under oppression. Some found fragments of family in unexpected places, recognizing a familiar song or scar. Others walked through their entire lives, never knowing where their blood had gone. The lost diary would one day trace these routes as lines and arrows, but maps could never capture the human cost woven into every mile. Names were the first thing taken, stripped away like clothing at the auction block. A person who had carried a lineage, a story, a history in their name, suddenly became Tom, Mary, or simply boy or girl, chosen casually by whoever owned them. The diary revealed how clerks preferred short Anglo names because they were easier to record, easier to command, and easier to forget. In cabins, people whispered their real names only at night, afraid that speaking them aloud might bring punishment. Over time, some children grew up never knowing what they had originally been called, believing the plantation name was all they had ever been. Identity began to blur, not because people forgot who they were, but because the world around them refused to recognize it. Erasure did not happen in one moment. It seeped into everyday life like poison. Bodies became official records instead of people. Plantation ledgers replaced names with numbers, markings, and descriptions of skin tone, height, or scars. Branding irons burned permanent symbols onto flesh, turning human beings into living property that could be traced like cattle. The diary detailed how these marks were checked during transfers, as though they were serial codes rather than wounds. Some enslaved people tried to hide or alter their scars, but ownership was etched too deeply to escape. Every mark carried both physical pain and psychological trauma, a reminder that their identity belonged to someone else. Children born into slavery inherited not just bondage, but the possibility of being branded as soon as they were deemed valuable. The body itself became a battlefield of identity. Language was slowly stripped away as well. Many enslaved people arrived speaking different African languages or dialects, but plantations punished communication that owners could not understand. Overseers forced English, breaking tongues through violence or humiliation. In secret, people still spoke fragments of their native words in songs, prayers, or whispers, but even these faded across generations. The diary noted how this linguistic control made rebellion harder and obedience easier. Without shared language, families found it difficult to pass down cultural memory or ancestral identity. Children learned only the words of their captors, growing further from the roots of their heritage. Silence became both protection and loss, a double-edged blade cutting through history. Family names were also erased through forced separation. When husbands, wives, or children were sold, there was no official recognition of their relationship in records. Ledgers listed individuals separately, as if kinship had never existed. The diary showed how this practice made it nearly impossible for families to trace one another later. Even when people knew their relatives were alive somewhere, there was no formal system to reconnect them. Over time, bloodlines became tangled, scattered, and forgotten in official history. Some elders tried to preserve lineage through storytelling, but those stories rarely survived beyond a few generations. The plantation system did not just enslave bodies, it fractured ancestry itself. Spiritual identity was attacked just as brutally. Many enslaved people practiced traditional beliefs, rituals, or customs tied to their African origins. Owners often banned these practices, forcing Christianity or suppressing worship entirely. Sacred objects were confiscated, ceremonies were broken apart, and spiritual leaders were punished. The diary hinted at how this spiritual control was another method of erasing identity. Without their faith traditions, people lost another connection to who they were before enslavement. Yet in hidden corners, some still prayed in their own ways, blending old beliefs with new ones to survive. Identity endured, but it was forced underground like a buried seed. Even memories were targeted for destruction. Children were often separated from elders who carried stories of their homeland or past life. Without those voices, the past slowly disappeared. Overseers discouraged nostalgia, labeling it dangerous or rebellious. The diary revealed that forgetting was sometimes seen as a sign of submission, proof that the enslaved had accepted their new identity. Some people resisted by carving symbols into wood, weaving meaning into cloth, or encoding history into songs. Still, much was lost, washed away by time and trauma. Erasure was not just physical, it was psychological, shaping how people saw themselves. By the time generations passed, many enslaved individuals existed in a liminal space between who they were and who they were forced to be. Their names, language, family ties, and even spiritual identity had been reshaped by bondage. The diary did not celebrate this, it documented it coldly, as if identity loss was simply part of plantation management. Yet beneath those records lay countless untold lives struggling to remember themselves in a world designed to erase them. Lanterns trembled as mothers stood on the edge of the auction yard, knowing that their words might be the last thing their children would ever carry from them. Some pressed foreheads together, breathing in the familiar scent of hair and skin, while overseers barked impatient orders. Their voices dropped to a murmur that only the wind and the night could hear, filled with love that had nowhere to go but into memory. Many tried to speak calmly, even as their hands shook, afraid that visible terror would make the moment even harsher. They told their children to remember their faces, their touch, and the rhythm of their heartbeat. In that fragile space between love and loss, words became a lifeline stretched across an invisible future. The diary later noted these exchanges as quiet disturbances, yet it could never capture the depth of what was being said. Some mothers did not speak at all but communicated through touch, tracing symbols into their child's palm as if carving a map into flesh. Fingers lingered on cheeks, foreheads, and arms, memorizing every curve. A few braided small pieces of cloth into hair or tucked worn beads into pockets, hoping these objects would carry meaning when words could not. Others pressed their lips to their child's ear, breathing stories too sacred to be spoken aloud in front of captors. In many cases, the children were too young to understand, yet the mothers spoke anyway, believing that emotion could outlast comprehension. The air around them felt thick with unshed tears and desperate tenderness. Even the lantern light seemed softer during these moments, as if it knew it was witnessing something unbearable. Songs emerged when speech failed. Soft lullabies turned into coded messages of survival. Mothers hummed melodies that carried instructions about remembering home, ancestors, and identity. These were not simple songs, but living archives, stitched together from generations of pain and endurance. The rhythm of the tunes matched the trembling of their bodies as chains rattled nearby. Some children clung to these melodies like lifelines, trying to imprint every note into their minds. For the mothers, singing was both comfort and protest, a way to speak truth without being silenced. The diary recorded fragments of these songs as eerie background noise, never grasping their meaning or power. As the moment of separation drew closer, many mothers shifted from comfort to urgency. They whispered names of relatives who might still be alive somewhere, begging their children to remember them. Some described distant rivers, forests, or villages that existed only in memory but felt more real than the plantation. They warned their children to be careful, to stay silent when needed, and to survive at all costs. Tears streamed freely now, carving pale lines through ash and dust on their faces. Children clutched clothing, trying to anchor themselves to their mothers as the world tilted beneath them. The yard became a living chorus of breath, sobs, and trembling whispers. Every word felt heavier than iron. In other cases, mothers spoke not to their children, but to strangers nearby, hoping messages might travel. They begged fellow enslaved people to watch over their sons or daughters if fate brought them together again. Some entrusted tiny secrets or family stories to others, trusting in a fragile network of shared suffering. These verbal promises were bonds stronger than chains, though invisible to those in power. Overseers tried to drown out such exchanges with shouts or threats, but words slipped through the cracks. The diary mentioned occasional commotion during auctions without understanding that it was grief searching for survival. Mothers turned community into a last refuge when blood ties were being torn apart. There were also mothers who froze into silence, overwhelmed by the impossibility of the moment. Their mouths moved but no sound came, their voices swallowed by shock. Instead, they held their children as long as allowed, imprinting love through touch rather than speech. Some stared past everything as if trying to see a future where reunion might still exist. Others rocked gently, repeating quiet prayers beneath their breath that no overseer could decipher. Even in stillness, their presence spoke volumes about what was being lost. The diary treated these women as compliant or resigned, never recognizing the storm raging inside them. Silence became another language of farewell. When the final call came and hands were forced apart, mothers often shouted words that echoed across the field, part blessing, part lament, part command to live. Their cries followed children as they were led away in chains, trailing like invisible threads between bodies. Some collapsed to the ground, others stood rigid as stone, and a few walked back toward the cabins carrying emptiness like a weight on their backs. In those moments, the plantation felt less like land and more like a wound. The lost diary would later turn these scenes into brief notes about disorder, yet every page trembled with what it failed to say about a mother's last breath toward her child under the fading lantern light. Life after separation did not return to normal because normal no longer existed. At dawn, those left behind walked into the fields carrying grief like a second body strapped to their backs. The sun rose over rows of sugarcane or cotton that seemed endless, swallowing every cry into silent labor. Hands that had held children hours earlier now gripped hoes, machetes, or baskets, trembling with exhaustion and heartbreak. Every step felt heavier, not from work, but from absence. Overseers moved through the fields with whips and rifles, pretending the previous night had been nothing more than routine business. Songs that once carried rhythm and unity turned into low, fractured hums that matched the broken spirit of the workers. Even the earth beneath their feet seemed to pulse with the memory of those who were gone. Inside the cabins, the air felt hollow and painful to breathe. Empty sleeping mats lay rolled up in corners where children or spouses had once rested. Cooking fires burned smaller, as if mourning the missing hands that used to feed them. Women moved through these spaces like ghosts, touching belongings that no longer had owners. Men stared at walls stained with smoke and years of whispered conversations now lost forever. Night brought little comfort, only sleepless hours filled with imagined footsteps outside. The quarters became a place where silence screamed louder than any cry. Grief settled into the wood, the dirt, and the bodies that remained. For those who were sold and carried away, life shifted into something harsher and colder. New plantations greeted them with unfamiliar faces, strange rules, and deeper isolation. They were assigned new cabins, new work, and sometimes even new names. Every sound felt foreign, every face a reminder that they were alone. Some were placed in brutal sugar fields where the heat blistered skin and burned hope. Others labored in cotton under relentless sun, backs bent until pain felt permanent. Chains might have been removed, but emotional captivity replaced them. They worked beside strangers who shared their suffering yet could not replace lost family. The contrast between those left behind and those taken away deepened the wound of separation. On one side, people endured familiar cruelty without their loved ones. On the other, they faced unknown brutality with no emotional anchor. Both sides carried the same ache but lived it differently. Those remaining behind wondered daily whether their family members were alive, dead, or suffering worse conditions. Those taken away wondered if anyone still remembered them or searched for their names. Distance stretched not just across land and water, but across hearts and memories. Survival became a lonely battle, fought in silence. Children suffered in their own terrifying way after separation. Some were forced to grow up overnight, taking on adult labor while still grieving their parents. Others were moved between owners like property, losing every sense of stability. Nightmares filled their sleep, replaying the moment of being torn from their mothers or fathers. Without family protection, they became vulnerable to harsher punishment and exploitation. Many forgot pieces of their past, not by choice, but by survival instinct. Laughter disappeared from their lives, replaced by obedience and fear. Childhood itself was stolen along with their families. Yet beneath the pain, quiet resilience began to form. People forged new bonds with those around them, creating makeshift families among fellow enslaved workers. Elders shared stories to keep memory alive, even when their own families were gone. Women cared for children who were not their own, trying to fill empty spaces left by separation. Men stood beside each other in the fields, offering silent strength during brutal labor. These connections did not erase loss, but softened its sharpest edges. Community became a fragile shelter against a system designed to destroy it. In that shared suffering, survival found a small but stubborn foothold. Still, the emotional scars never healed. Every sunset reminded people of loved ones who might be watching the same sky from far away. Every song carried hidden names and prayers for reunion. Births, deaths, and everyday moments unfolded under the shadow of separation. Some spent their entire lives searching, hoping, or waiting for a reunion that never came. Others held on to faint memories as their only connection to family. The plantation system continued to grind forward, indifferent to broken hearts and shattered families.